Hello and welcome to Reverie True Crime. I'm your host, Paige. On January 2nd, 1935, in Kansas City, Missouri, Roland T. Owen checked into the Hotel President. He paid for one night and requested a room that overlooked the courtyard instead of the street. The address he gave the bellboys when he checked in was a Los Angeles, California address. Roland looked to be around 20 to 35 years old, 5'10", 180 pounds, blue eyes with long, curly, dark brown hair, a visible scar above his ear on his scalp, and a cauliflower ear. He was dressed in a black overcoat. A bellhop named Randolph Probst led Roland, who had no luggage, into the elevator to go to the 10th floor. On the way up, Roland told the bellhop that he had stayed at another hotel close by the night before, but the price of $5 a night, which would be around $110 in today's money, was a little bit too steep for him. He also told the bellhop out of the blue, "I don't expect to ever give another party again." Randolph thought it was a random swear-off statement, and maybe the guy had a crazy New Year's party that had been too much for him. Randolph replied, laughing, "Oh, you'll get over that." Roland angrily responded, "No, last night's party was my last party." When they arrived on the 10th floor, Randolph unlocked room 1046. Roland went inside, taking out a hairbrush, comb, and toothpaste out of the pocket of his overcoat, placing them above the sink. The bellhop shortly after went to go grab the key for the room and handed it to Roland. Then they both went back down to the lobby. Roland left the hotel, but he wasn't gone very long. By the time Mary Soptic, the maid, went to room 1046, she was startled by Roland because she did not know the woman who had been staying in that room had checked out. Mary told him that she was sorry and began cleaning the room. As she was cleaning up, she saw that the window shades were drawn shut and only one very dim lamp was turned on. Mary said it seemed as if the man was either worried about something or scared, because every time she went to the room, the shades were drawn shut and he was under dim lighting. As Mary finished cleaning up, Roland told her that a few friends were going to be visiting shortly. He brushed his hair and put his overcoat back on. Roland asked Mary to leave the door unlocked when she was leaving out, and she did. A few hours later, it was around 4 in the afternoon when Mary went to give Roland a few towels she had just washed and dried. Again, the room was dark, but she could make out Roland lying on the bed, still in all of his clothes. The light from the hallway shined on the bedside table, and she saw a note that said, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." On the morning of January 3rd, around 10:30, Mary went to go into room 1046, but the door was locked. The door was locked from the outside. She let herself in with a hotel key, thinking Roland wasn't there. To her surprise, there he was, sitting in the dark room. Therefore, someone else had locked the door. Not long after, the phone in the room began to ring, and when Roland answered it, he told the person on the other end of the line, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast. No, I'm not hungry." Still on the phone, he asked Mary if she cleaned the entire 10th floor and if the hotel was a residential one. Roland told Mary the same thing he said to Randolph the bellhop about the price of the other hotel that he had spent the night at. She finished cleaning and walked out of the room, but she would return later at 4 p.m. When she went to the door to deliver the towels, she could hear the voices of two men having a conversation. She began to knock on the door. A man who she didn't think was Roland, because this man had a loud, rough tone of voice, wanted to know who was at the door, to which Mary responded she was there to drop off some towels. The man replied, "We don't need any. We've got enough." However, Mary knew Roland was in fact in need of towels because she had taken all of the towels out of the bathroom that morning when she cleaned. Around 6 o'clock that evening, a woman who lived in Lee's Summit, close to Kansas City, checked into the hotel after she got done shopping that day. She didn't feel well and didn't want to be on the road that night. She stayed in room 1048, which was the room adjoined to Roland's. Later, she could hear noisy men and women loudly spewing profanities. She thought it was a rowdy party, but she wasn't sure. Her boyfriend worked at a flower shop in Kansas City, and he went to visit her, getting there around 9:30 that night. The two hung out in the room for a couple of hours, and the loud profanities went on through the night. An elevator operator named Charles Blotcher went into work at midnight and later reported that most of the guests at the hotel were settled down by 1:30 that morning, except the noisy people in room 1055. They were having a party. Charles recalled his shift and said the hotel had a frequent visitor, a woman who he thought was a sex worker. She would only stop by rooms occupied by men. She was at the hotel the early morning of the 4th, asking Charles to take her to the 10th floor to room 1026. After about a half an hour of being on the 10th floor, Charles said she came back down the elevator. She left the hotel lobby and returned an hour later with a gentleman. They went to the 9th floor. Between 4 and 5 a.m., he took two middle-aged women down the elevator, and between 5 and 6 a.m., a man who carried a Gladstone bag and a briefcase got onto the elevator. He said he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary about any of these people or their actions that night or morning. Except many people wonder if the woman going to room 1026 meant 1046 and if she had anything to do with what would happen that night. January 4th, a switchboard operator noticed at 7 a.m. room 1046's phone had been off the hook for a long time. Randolph was told to go check on Roland. When the bellboy got to his room, it was locked, and a Do Not Disturb sign was left on the door. Someone said in a low tone, "Come in." Randolph knocked a few more times, and the same person said, "Turn on the lights." The door was still locked, and no one went to the door to let Randolph in, so he told Roland, "Just put the phone back on the hook." When he went back to the lobby, he told the operator the man seemed to be drunk, and maybe she should wait an hour to send someone up if the phone was still not on the hook. A little over an hour went by when another bellboy, Harold Pike, used his passkey to go into room 1046 after he knocked many times with no answer. He put the phone back on the hook himself. Harold did not turn on the room light when he entered the room. Instead, he let the hallway light shine in. The phone stand had been knocked over. He picked it up and put the phone back on the receiver. He also noticed Roland seemed to be drunk, nude in the bed, and the bedding around him had a dark spot on it. Harold thought it was only a shadow. Randolph was told around 10:30 that morning that again, room 1046's phone had been seemingly knocked off the hook. He went to Roland's room and was barely able to open the door. Randolph reported, quote, "At 11:03, the operator told me to go back to room 1046 and tell the man to put his receiver on the hook. I found the transom of the room open as it was on my previous call. I knocked loudly 3 times and got no response. I then used the pass key, and when I entered the room, the man was within 2 feet of the door, on his knees and elbows, holding his head in his hands. I noticed blood on his head. I turned the lights on, placed the receiver on the hook, and saw blood on the walls, on the bed, and in the bathroom. This frightened me, and I left the room immediately and informed Mr. Weaver, assistant manager of the hotel. He and the manager and myself returned to the room and opened the door about 6 inches. The man was against the door and we could not open it farther, so we closed it and left. And shortly after this, I saw a doctor and the police there. I saw them take this man out to the general hospital, where I learned later he died." When the police and the doctor got to Roland's room, he was alive, but barely. Roland had gotten himself into the bathroom, where he was in the basin with his legs sticking out, possibly trying to get a drink of water from the faucet. A detective arrived and asked him who else had been in the room. Roland was in and out of consciousness and had trouble speaking, but managed to mumble that no one else had been in the room, that he fell against the basin. Detectives stated after seeing his injuries and examining the rooms, that was not what happened. Roland was sent to the hospital, where he died a little after midnight on January 5th, 1935. Roland had been tied up with pieces of white cotton wrapping cord about the thickness of a thin pencil, similar to a clothesline around his neck, wrists, and ankles. The knots were simple and triple tied. Detective Johnson said these details were important due to the amateur way the knots were tied. Roland had been struck repeatedly in the head and suffered a skull fracture. He'd also been stabbed multiple times in the chest and had a punctured lung. His wrists had been slashed, as well as bruising around his neck, where it seemed someone had been strangling him. Dr. H.F. Flanders determined Roland's injuries happened 6 or 7 hours before he was ever found. His cause of death was a triple skull fracture. Detectives believed he had been hit with the butt of a revolver or a hammer. Authorities found no weapons, no clothes, or any belongings of Roland T. Owens at all. They quickly concluded that it was not a suicide attempt. Detective Ira Johnson was told by a woman in the adjoining room that she clearly heard 2 women and 2 men very loudly in room 1046. After looking into the address Roland left with the bellboys, police found out the address did not exist. Detective Ira Johnson had wrestled a bit when he was younger, and after seeing Roland had a cauliflower effect on his left ear, he thought Roland could have been a wrestler or boxer. Roland also had an odd underarm muscular development that is also seen in wrestlers and boxers. Detective Johnson had some wrestling promoters come to look at the body to see if they could positively identify the man. Roland T. Owen was suspected to be a fake name. The detective also believed whoever tortured Roland did so for information or revenge. One wrestling promoter said a few weeks before he believed it was this man who asked him about wrestling for a crowd, but no one knew his real name. 3 detectives, along with Detective Sergeant Frank Howland, were sure they would find out who murdered this man and what their motive was. They'd only found a necktie label, an unsmoked cigarette, 4 small blood-stained fingerprints on a lampshade, a shattered drinking glass in the bathtub, a, quote, glass bearing a woman's fingerprints, and a hairpin. The couple that had the adjoining room heard at least 4 people, one being a woman, in room 1046 who had been arguing with each other. They heard a gasp and at the time thought it was someone snoring. Police questioned hotel staff about how someone could have carried out Roland's clothes unnoticeably, but they all stated they didn't see anyone carrying any clothes out. 2 days had passed and over 300 people had viewed the man's body in desperate attempts to identify him. One man, Robert A. Lane, had been one of the people who went to see the body. He told the police the man was running alongside the street, only wearing pants, shoes, and an undershirt. The man flagged Robert down, thinking he was a taxi driver. The man asked Robert if he could take him somewhere that he could hail a taxi. After realizing the man had an injured arm that was bleeding, Robert told him, "You look as if you had been in trouble." Robert said the man replied that he was gonna kill the person tomorrow. After finding a cab, the passenger got out of Robert's car. A few bartenders came forward, saying a man who looked like the victim had been on 12th Street, and they said 2 women were with him. After the initial search of the room, Detective Johnson and Detective William Eldridge went back a few days later. A blood-stained towel that had not been in the room during the first search added to the unsettling mystery. On January 9th, the Kansas City Star and other newspapers released a sketch of the victim asking if anyone had seen the man or knew anything about him. The investigation was ongoing, and detectives looked into the clues of a man named Don, who the victim talked to on the phone and left a note for. They suspected it was a man named Don Kelso, who was later tried for committing another gruesome murder. However, there was no evidence to prove that this Don was the assailant or involved in any way. When it was announced that the victim was being buried, a man anonymously called the funeral home and said that he would pay for the man to have a funeral. When he was asked about how he knew the deceased, the man said, according to the KCPD memo, quote, "Owen had not played the game fair, and cheaters usually get what's coming to them." On March 23rd, the funeral home received the money to cover the funeral inside of a newspaper. It was delivered with 12 American Beauty roses and a card. Inside of the card, somebody wrote, "Love forever, Louise." Over a year went by with no answers until Ruby Ogletree from Birmingham, Alabama, saw the case talked about in an American weekly newspaper in November of 1936. She also identified the marking above the man's ear as a grease burn that happened when he was only 11 months old. The victim was her adventurous son, 19-year-old Artemus Ogletree, who left with his friend Joe Simpson in April of 1934 hitchhiking. The two boys eventually ended up in Los Angeles, California, where Joe said they split up. Ruby did not make the connection because a lot of things had taken place between his actual murder in 1935 and when she found this out in late 1936. In the spring of 1935, a few of his letters to her arrived after his death, which was also alarming. Not only that, but the letters were typed, and Artemus did not know how to type. Also, the way the letters were written didn't sound like her son. She told the police that her son arrived in Kansas City in August of 1934, where he stayed at the St. Regis Hotel, which is now an apartment complex. The person he was with signed the hotel registry as Don Kelso. In the beginning of 1935, Artemus checked into the Muhlebach Hotel under another fake name. That was the hotel he told Randolph was too expensive. In August of 1935, it was 8 months after Artemis's death when Ruby received a very disturbing phone call out of Memphis, Tennessee. At this point, she had no idea her son was actually dead. The person calling said their name was Godfrey Jordan, and he'd met Artemus in Cairo, Egypt. Godfrey said Artemus saved him from a, quote, band of thugs. The conversation went on for 45 minutes and left Ruby feeling uneasy. By November of 1935, not knowing where her son was or what happened to him, she had contacted the State Department to find out if Artemus had a passport. She also got in touch with authorities at Customs to figure out if her son had somehow set sail without a passport. She wrote the American consulate in Cairo, Egypt, and the FBI. In January of 1936, she wrote President Franklin Roosevelt, saying, quote, "I fear he has fallen into some gang or something has happened to him. He has always been a good boy and has high ideals. I simply must find some trace of him. If he is in trouble, I want to know." In 1940, police made one man, Thomas Wilbur Barlow, take a lie detector test, and he had to give handwriting samples, which were sent to the FBI. He had been convicted of crimes against nature in Little Blue, Missouri. Detectives suspected Artemus was one victim of many that were killed by a sex maniac. Officers believed Thomas's handwriting matched Don Kelso's. He was questioned for about 10 hours and gave many different stories. Afterwards, the police said he was suffering from confusion due to having syphilis. There was another lead out of New York that Chief of Detectives T.J. Higgins was invested in. A convicted murderer, Joseph Ogden, was the person who T.J. Higgins concluded killed Artemus. However, there's no solid evidence to prove that claim. Joseph did murder Oliver George Senecal by shooting and dismembering him. He also carved off a tattoo that Oliver had, which would have been a quick way to identify him. After he put Oliver's naked body into a steamer trunk that was headed to Memphis, Tennessee, the trunk was passing through Penn Station, where they held it there on suspicion and found the body inside. Kansas City Magazine obtained admission records to Sing Sing Prison from the New York State Archives, finding that Joseph Ogden served time in various prisons and 2 insane asylums. One of those asylums was in Birmingham, Alabama. The documents also state that Joseph escaped prison and had a, quote, history of homosexuality. One of his aliases was in fact Donald Kelso. This convinced the KC police and the New Yorker's editor that Joseph Ogden killed Artemis. The New Yorker reported, quote, from samples of his handwriting, Kansas City police identified him as Donald Kelso, who had strangled a waiter named Ogletree in 1935, leaving the body nude in a hotel room. For 2 years after this murder, Kelso wrote periodically to the victim's mother in the South, assuring her that her son was in good health and traveling in Europe. Though the FBI report stated the handwriting did not match up, quote, it was concluded that the signature of Donald Kelso on the hotel registration card was not written by Joseph Ogden. The investigation went on until December of 1950, when the FBI cleared the quote-unquote degenerate and seemingly pushed the case to the side. Even though the police had tried to reassure Ruby Ogletree that her son's friend, Joe Simpson, had been thoroughly questioned, she still had her suspicions. She spent many years trying to get Joe to talk to her, to meet up with her in Birmingham, but he would never show up when he said he would. She was sure that Joe did something to her son after confronting him in December of 1939. Quote, in talking with the boy, Joe Simpson, I was reasonably convinced that he is the person that talked to me from Memphis, Tennessee 7 months after my son was killed. He did say he did believe the case would never break, as there were no clues and left nothing for the G-men to work on. Ruby told Joe, Kansas City can well boast of it being the perfect crime. Joe laughed and responded, it is. They'll never get the ones who killed him. Ruby said she looked the boy in the eyes and said that she would know the voice that talked to her from Memphis. She said he turned red, dropped his eyes, and was nervous. Ruby said that Joe told her he supposedly had a letter that Artemis had written to her, and it was, quote, badly typed. He agreed to meet back up with her and give it to her in person, but he never did. As mentioned, Artemis had never learned how to type, and every letter he sent before his murder were all handwritten. So this was strange, and Ruby was sure Joe Simpson was her son's killer. To this day, the case has never been solved. That is the story of Artemis Ogletree and the murder mystery in room 1046. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe and take care.